It was a proto-Zionist ideology that required no Jews to be invented, just Christians with power, maps, and a theology that treated prophecy like a real estate deal and a modern crusade. And into that walked Mormonism, right? There's a story you probably haven't heard, either in Sunday school or your decolonial reading group or in your 19th century politics reading. And it's this idea that the modern Zion, a divinely ordained return to the promised land, it's not just a Jewish idea. And before Theodor Herzl ever wrote anything, and before the Balfour Declaration, before Zionism became the state ideology of Israel, it had already taken shape on the violent, God-haunted frontier of the United States. And its loudest cheerleaders were the Mormons. That's the Mormons, the very American, very colonial, and very expansionist movement that stormed into Utah with the Bible in one hand and a settler militia in the other. What they called Zion was never just a religious dream. It was a political project, and that project just didn't stay in Utah. It sailed across the Atlantic and set up shop back in Victorian England, and it ended up feeding directly into the imperial ideology that made modern Zionism possible. And what I'm saying here is not any type of conspiracy. It's just how empire works and how even salvation is a round-trip commodity to upholding this thing. And so if you start with the basics of this, in 1830, the Book of Mormon is written by Joseph Smith in upstate New York. It's a white settler origin story dressed up in biblical cosplay. It claims that indigenous people are the descendants of ancient Israelites cursed by God and are waiting for the true gospel to return. And where is it supposed to return? And where is the gospel supposed to be restored? In America, specifically in a new Zion that white believers are supposed to gather and build from scratch. So yeah, it's Southern theology from day one. And when Brigham Young led thousands of Mormons into the Great Basin of the 1840s, again, it was not just a religious pilgrimage, it was a military campaign. They founded a theocratic proto-state. They diverted rivers, laid out irrigation grids, launched attacks on the Ute and the Shoshone, and claimed that it was all in service of God's will. And these weren't disorganized gold rush drifters. They were a coherent settler society with divine land claim and a breeding strategy. And the U.S. government eventually absorbed the territory into Utah, but not before the Mormons had done the work of pacifying the land of the indigenous peoples. And so the thing about this is that colonizing a desert with a self-sustained religious state, you need lots of people, lots of them. And not just settlers, you need believers. So the LDS Church turned its gaze, like as the frontier moved back, the wave went all the way back, all the way across the Atlantic. And the LDS Church found itself riding the crest of that wave all the way back to England. In 1837, just 7 years after the Book of Mormon was published, Mormon missionaries landed in Liverpool and they started to hit pay dirt. Victorian Britain was full of people who were poor, displaced, and disillusioned with state religion. And add to that the simmering fascination with biblical prophecy and Israelite myths. And so you get a population ripe for this type of conversion. And by 1890, there's 91,000 converts in Britain and in Scandinavia that had packed up and moved to Utah. Like, that's how it spread. It was a literal, like, a mission to get people to be a part of the settler project. And not just individuals, whole families, congregations, communities. They called it gathering to Zion. And that phrase didn't just refer to what was a spiritual home. It meant like literal, a physical land where prophecy, property, and population could all come together to form a social project. And now you got two-way traffic, right? Mormonism borrows from British prophecy culture and then sends thousands of converts to the frontier in the West to live in. But something else is happening here in Britain too. And long before Herzl dreamed of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, evangelical Protestants in Britain were already obsessed with the idea. They called it restorationism, the belief that Jesus wouldn't return until the Jews were restored to their ancient homeland, and not metaphorically either, right? Literally. And Lord Shaftesbury, one of the most powerful evangelical voices in British politics, yeah, he pushed very much for the British to help restore Jews to Palestine as both a religious duty and a geopolitical strategy. And the idea was very much like, God wants this. We'll be able to secure a foothold in the Ottoman Empire, rolled into one belief. And the slogan became a land for a people and a people for a land. And doesn't that sound familiar? Preachers like Charles Spurgeon and J.C. Ryle turned it into like a gospel, and newspapers ran with it. It was a proto-Zionist ideology that required no Jews to be invented, just Christians with power, maps, and a theology that treated prophecy like a real estate deal and a modern crusade. And into that walked Mormonism, right? Specifically British Mormonism, converts who returned home from their mission work and had pamphlets that were preaching about people doing literal gathering in Israel, in Utah. They weren't talking about Palestine, but the logic was the same prophecy, right? Like it was prophecy, homeland, migration, in a state, in an ethno state. And one was Christian American and the other one was Christian British. Both were practice runs for what is today modern Zionism. It was literally, both of them are setting up settler colonial states in the desert against a indigenous population. And so by the time Theodore Herzl began pitching the idea of a Jewish state to European elites in the 1890s, the soil had well been fertilized because the British ruling class didn't need convincing. They had been reading about this stuff in Sunday sermons for 50 years. Shaftesbury had written about it. Christian newspapers had endorsed it. Mormon pamphlets had rehearsed it. So when Herzl asked for support, he didn't sound like a radical. He sounded like the fulfillment of a long-held Christian dream had just arisen. And by 1917, when British issued the Balfour Declaration promising a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, it was essentially just echoing Victorian restorationist theology. The Zion they now endorsed was Jewish, but it had been conceptually rehearsed by both Christian Zionists and Mormon settlers alike. The LDS model didn't just offer ideological parallels, it offers practical ones too, because Mormons had already done it. They had already mobilized tens of thousands of people to migrate to a promised land and build a religious ethno-state and defend it militarily, all backed by modern state infrastructure. And so the Zionist project now had both moral and precedent and a working prototype, the colonial project of the Mormons in Utah. And that goes back to the thing that I was saying about how like the Western frontier was godless. BC especially, transient gold rush towns, little religious infrastructure, no treaties, no moral compass, and that is very true to a point. But when you zoom out, BC was one version of the frontier, this secular, extractive, improvisational colonial project, but Utah was the other because it was upheld by religion, organized, theological, and no less colonial, but in this way that like an individualized relationship with God made it so that it was no longer attuned to anything higher, like institutionally, besides just their straight up settler colonial project. And that's the thing, is that like in BC, they made space for, saloons and brothels, while the other place made space for temples and churches and boys clubs and stuff like that, right? But both operate in the same way to take indigenous land, expand empire, and export their logic back, like to maintain an imperial core. And Mormon Zionism isn't some quirky American cult idea. It's a concrete example of how prophecy, migration, and statehood all work together to create a functional settler colonial project. And that example traveled back with the crest of the wave, and it influenced British religious thinking, and then validated Christian imperial dreams, and it built the conceptual runway for Herzl and Balfour and the real-world Zionist project that would explode into the 20th century and culminating with the Nakba. And this is the thing, is that people get it, I think, backwards. Like the frontier didn't destroy religion. It invented a new one. Mormonism was one of them. Born in empire, forged in conquest, exported through empire again. Its idea of Zion didn't stay in Utah. It crossed the ocean, joined joined forces with Christian imperial prophecy and then helped set the stage for a settler colonial project thousands of miles away. And this isn't a story about theology, it's a story about power. How myths become policy, how settler projects become sacred, and how salvation gets sold as a return ticket, right? Like the American frontier wasn't godless, it was God making in its own image. And Zion is still cashing that check. And whether it's in Utah or in Tel Aviv, it's the same project.